What's up, ladies and gentlemen? I just want to talk a bit about American expansion, as that is sort of the focus of the end of our class, looking at how America moved westward. And it's sort of a journey up until 1890, when it was declared the West was won, expansion was done, the United States can be seen from one ocean to the other, with pushing out the Spanish, pushing out the French, but also pushing aside vast, numerous, and powerful native peoples of the Americas. And that story still continues, but the development of what we now see as the United States of America is that journey from basically 1800, the end of the Revolutionary War in the 1780s, up until 1890. It really shows expansion. And there's three directions you have to sort of look at and understand how this works early on. First, you have to understand one particular man, Thomas Jefferson, and his vision and direction and changes in this Republican nation in his Republican ideals. And remember, look at that in the textbook of how that differs to the Federalist views. And his idea, his sort of things that he focused on was both the dangers to the country being high population, high density, and social evils it generated. So he's looking at, as examples in Europe, that there's cities that have high concentration of people. This is a very famous painting by Hogarth. Really what he's talking about here is the sins of gin, the alcohol gin, and it's kind of split in two. Here's ale. So there's just problems with ale, but people are pretty social. People are a little handsy. But over here, they're throwing the baby over the thing, and this absolute chaos having to do all because of gin. But Jefferson saw something different here. He says the sins is not the alcohol, but it's the concentration, the density of people in cities. So his suggestion is to not have people concentrated in land, but having to have an agrarian lifestyle on one side, but also the concentration of money and power in the hands of few people is also a problem and also going to destroy the nation. So looking at both those two things, westward expansion was his highest agenda, and it remained the agenda of American building for the rest of the century, and arguably even to today. Even in Northern California, where Shasta College is located, you should be pretty aware, if you've driven on I-5, signs welcoming you to the Jefferson State. The Jefferson State and the ideals of the Jefferson being called the Jefferson State is because of the same value systems that Thomas Jefferson was looking at. He's looking for an agrarian sort of culture, looking at directions of a country and individuals with a life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, having their own land, agrarian lifestyle, taking it away from the power from a few into the hands of many for the most part, although that's arguable as well. And his idea of having small government, reducing the army size, abolishing taxes on, most popular on whiskey, very popular if you remember the Whiskey Rebellion, and that it was a very small executive branch to really bring it down to the bare bones and to not have a strong federal government, but have strong state governments. His duties for him, in his mindset of a federal executive branch, was to maintain a strong postal service, maintaining federal courts, staffing lighthouses. And why is that important? Well, that's the whole movement of everything in and out of America to Europe and abroad, to China, to India as that starts to open up, the Mediterranean, all that. And they need to have safe international water safety in the lighthouses, collecting customs duties, so getting the taxes, and conducting census every 10 years. That was, to him, the heart of the government. All the other stuff has to deal with the Congress, has to deal with the state rights, and it was his direction. So Jefferson's one important thing to look at in this chapter and his motivations, and compare that to Jackson later on that we've already looked at. But in connection with Jefferson and his ideal of moving westward, expansion, opening up lands for agrarian new states to be formed, and collectively creating power in this country, the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. If you look at this map, that doubles the size of the already existing United States. From Louisiana Purchase, you get a new direction of Jeffersonian politics, looking in expansion, continental expansion across what is now the United States. So you get the Louisiana Purchase of 1803 after France decides to give it up, losing their biggest cash cow, the most important island in the Caribbean, and putting more resources into expansion in Europe. They see a great opportunity to get money, important money, to fund Napoleon's wars, but also United States sees opportunity to double the land size of the country, and Jefferson loves that. He's able to mount a federal treasury surplus, increase national income, expand the borders, doubling the border, and sending, as you read about, the famous Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, both clerks to the president himself, sending them out to expand, to explore, and see, and make relations with the people in this new territory. Very famously, and an important part of this, is Sacagawea, and as a person that goes with them, she speaks multiple languages. Her story is depicted in the reading, so please see her important role. But it's to also bridge and to understand, not to conquer the people of this territory. Jefferson, to be successful, has to ally with the powerful natives of these areas, which, if you're familiar with the old game Oregon Trail, this should look very familiar, because what they are marking out is the very route of which would become the Oregon Trail of westward expansion later in the later century. Now, Jefferson's small government was good for some, but an unfilled promise to most. Think of, for women, there was a lot of subjugation of women to men. African Americans still enslaved. Native Americans being pushed off their land, and yeoman craftsmen, small business owners, still trying to make a name for themselves. So that's something to look at in this reading, is how people are responding, how everybody in this country is responding. But Native Americans in Jefferson Republic, what he says is that if whites lift Indians out of their savagery and their uncivilized state, they will grow. He said that. He says that using Enlightenment ideas of certain taxonomies of individuals, this is where racism comes out of. But his view is that Native Americans are formed in mind as well as in body. They're good. And they're the same as the Homo sapiens europaeus. So back in those days, there was the Homo sapiens africanus, African Americans or Africans. There's Homo sapiens europaeus. There's Homo sapiens. There's different types. And that was to scientifically justify racism. Using the scientific justifications of racism, but he's saying Native Americans are the same. They are just culturally retarded, is what he would say. And so his idea, and this should look familiar from what you've looked at in these chapters, is that he's thinking, look, if we move these Native people out of their environment, specifically in Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, specifically Cherokees, but many others as well, if we take them out, move them to this new territory, which is going to become Oklahoma and part of it, but in this Louisiana Purchase, move them out there and start to nurture them, start to be like a father figure to them, and then we will allow them to grow and become civilized. On the other hand, you have people like Chief John Ross, the chief of the Cherokee Nation that you read about, that you saw in the documentary, creating a constitution for the Cherokee Nation, creating a newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix, printed in English and with a written language of the Cherokee language, looking at how to not assimilate so much, but to synchronize two cultures together. a Cherokee and an American culture within the same territory. And so his constitution, though annulled when gold was found on the land, so Georgia annulled the Constitution, and there are rights when gold was found there. But he did take his problems to the Supreme Court, and he won the case. If you remember right, he won the case that Indian justice in federal courts was upheld, but President Jackson at the time overruled it, vetoed it, and created the Indian Removal Act in 1830. In that Indian Removal Act, 100 million acres vacated for white settlement under the authority of ethnic expulsion of all Indians west of Mississippi, specifically to the Indian Territory. And this was not widely accepted. In fact, it was widely controversial by both government and public opinion in the newspapers. There was a bunch of cartoons kind of showing what was happening here. And one would think, as it was quoted, one would think the guilt of African slavery was enough for the nation to bear. Remember, millions of slaves, still slaves in this country in the 1830s, without the additional crime and injustices to the Indians. So you have two different stories. You have growth of the nation, but at the same time, at what cost? And as historians, we have to be understanding of both. It's not black or white, completely good, completely bad. There is a gray area, but we have to understand of what the horrors the country did to make sure we try not to go down the same route again, and at the same time understand the beauty of a country that was created, that was an idea to create men and women to become equal, and how to use that in this 21st century, understanding its past to not repeat it and to move forward in a more positive direction. So how do we reconcile with presidents and people of our past, our founding fathers, who on one side would say African Americans are inferior to whites, though having an affair with his slave, selling hemming, having problems with African American mathematicians like Benjamin Banker, who he said, this mathematician, astronomer, he said there's no way he came up with these ideas himself. He must have had help from a white person. At the same time, talking about Native Americans, himself and Andrew Jackson, talking about how they're the great father to these inferior, unhappy race. How do we reconcile and understand these individuals? Are they just products of their time? Or is this something that we need to understand in the deep-rooted nature of the country? It's up to you to decide. But to understand the past, to not destroy it, to not silence it, whether it's good or bad, we need to remember all of this and understand the diversity of the story of the American growth of this country.